Welcome back to another day in U.S. history, guys. This is Era 2, the American Revolution. Change is coming. Era 2, remember that we will explore how money and unfair laws influenced the colonies to fight for their independence from England. We are just going to remind ourselves real quick that revolution means to change. We do have a lot of changes coming to the colonies in this era. So today, we will identify tensions in Boston, Massachusetts, why protests and boycotts cause major issues and result in punishments. And how will you be doing this? Today, you will tag a message to the King's soldiers on the wall around the Boston Harbor. So you're going to get to do some art today that I hope you enjoy. So a reminder that Boston is right here in the boot of Massachusetts, okay? This is a pretty important colony that we focused on prior to this date when we talked about the Pilgrims in Plymouth. But Boston becomes a major place for protest during this era. Excuse me. So now we're going to turn to page 27 in our virtual notebooks to look at today's activities. So here we have boycotts and protests in Boston, Massachusetts. The immediate reaction to the king's taxes was boycotts. Remember, this word boycotts means a form of protest where you stop buying things. Okay, I'm just going to highlight this because it's important. The colonists did their best to protest the taxation without representation. In 1770, tensions boiled over in Boston. A group of protesters gathered outside a British tax office, and 5 were shot and killed by British soldiers. This event became known as the Boston Massacre. So the first thing we're going to do today, in your Google Classroom, there is a copy of the Boston Massacre linked. You're going to take a minute to zoom in and out of the image and answer these 3 questions. All right, so let's move on now to page 28. The Sons of Liberty respond to the Boston Massacre. A group of patriots organized against the King of England. They became famous for shouting "No taxation without representation" and began to discuss what to do about the tyrant king. Tyrant means somebody who basically has total control and abuses their power. The Sons of Liberty poster that you see here was actually one of the first recorded posters used in the Americas. So it's a piece of history. I want you to take a minute to analyze it. What do you think this cartoon represents? All right, let's share out. The Boston Tea Party is next. The Sons of Liberty dressed as Indians and threw British tea chests worth almost $1 million into the Boston Harbor to protest the taxes and Boston Massacre. So now we know that this is a huge disagreement. As you can imagine, the king is very upset over the loss of $1 million worth of tea. So I want you to fill in the speech bubble with what you think the king would say about this. You're going to double click right here in the speech bubble and give me some strong words from the King of England. And our final activity for today in Boston are called the King's punishments or the intolerable acts. Intolerable is a word that means you cannot stand these punishments. The following punishments were in retaliation to the Boston Tea Party. A, the king closed the port of Boston until the colonists paid for the tea. This is like closing the market. You can't sell or buy products, so it would make the colonists very upset. B, the king appointed a governor, which took away power from the colonists who had previously chosen their own leaders. So imagine all of those colonial leaders that had been elected are now pushed out, and the king sends his own governors to take over. And finally, C, the king moved trials back to England where he could be the judge. So if he felt like you broke one of his rules or laws, he would have you shipped back to England where he could judge you. First, we're going to explain in your own opinion which of the punishments you think is the worst. And finally, okay, imagine that you were a colonist who lived in Boston in 1774. Graffiti this wall that surrounds the harbor with a message to the king's soldiers. Now, there's different ways you can do this. You can text box it, or you can give a sheet of paper and you can tag yourself the message, okay, using some kind of graffiti, and then of course post it right here on the wall by snapping a picture. I'm excited to see what you guys put up here, and we will see you tomorrow.